Alrighty, let's do it.
All right, we're live. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives, and welcome to another interview with Nick. Nick at Pizza Pickle Spur at Twitter. And Nick, I saw you publishing a video presentation that you just did, and you identified yourself as Nick St. James. Is that the way we should think of you?
No, that's just a moniker, and I picked that up at some point in the last year. It's not actually a family name. It just was a name that someone gave me during one of the shows, and it stuck. So I used it, and it's nice to have a full name, but it is a pseudonym, and I maintain my anonymity because of some of the deaths of earlier whistleblowers in the area of research that I work in. I think that it's an appropriate precaution. And I didn't enter this examination of history and science and policy to become a personality or to start shows or anything like that. I just, as I went through this process, I wanted to make sure that it was solid. And by the time I got through many, many years of essential reconciliation and learning terminology and learning science and going back and getting full text copies of a lot of this stuff, it became very clear to me that it was a very serious hypothesis about the origin. What we're talking about here is the laboratory origin of HIV. So coming back to why the pseudonym, it's because I have a reason to live. I love my life and my family and my loved ones, and I want to make sure that this message doesn't get lost to history.
Well, Saint Nick of Time is another one, I guess, is it not?
That's just a channel name that I've got in a couple places like Rumble, where I've gathered together some of the very good conversations, I'd say, from the last year. Because I've been doing these presentations for now about, I think about 5 years. And they generally have gotten cleaner and leaner, so that's good. And I've recently had some conversations with larger groups of bench scientists. I was able to present to the panda scientists. And so that allows me on those channels to take some of those conversations and make them, live on in perpetuity, as well as presenting some good documentary material that's kind of essential to the conversation and fills in some of the details about the history.
Well, I've watched your classes on it, class 100, 200, and I think you did it, was it 250 or 150, the third one.
I did a
But
150 because it was kind of a halfway point. Yeah.
and now I'm just sharing on the screen the title thumbnail of Louisiana's Sister Squad podcast, the presentation of Dark Science, just a few days ago, a picture of Cold Spring Harbor Labs. And you sent me that earlier. I watched through about maybe two-thirds of it before I ran out of time. But yeah, it ties all of this stuff together and puts together a lot of the slides that I've seen. And you and I went through some of your work along those lines the last time we got together. But I wanted to just kind of ask you about what you've been able to accomplish in terms of speaking to the powers that be, or academic people, or perhaps scientists, or God forbid, medical doctors. Um, it it's just that I personally, from I've studied of what you've done, I'm totally impressed with it, and I think that you, if we could just get this stuff out into the public discourse, that so much of the other stuff would then be revealed, because it's, I mean, Cold Spring Harbor is a perfect linchpin that ties so much of it together. But people are not going to do the research. People are not going to question, the the authority of the Rockefeller medical institutions, and it's just not happening. But what you have discovered, to me, I mean, even just the cover up itself is a huge story and needs to be told. So, um, I mean, I'm just saying, Godspeed to you, and tell us a little bit about your, for instance, these two, the effort you just described at Panda, and other work that you've been able to do, and then we can talk about, what roadblocks you run into, the obvious, you know, kind of troll like question that you must have to field from time to time.
Oh, sure, sure. Well, so part of being a Cheshire Cat is that I need to just sort of phase in and out and share the research and the information and then disappear. So that means that I don't leave behind financial data. There's no online footprint to come to my website and get all of the data. I generally distribute attachments, PDF documents in the course of these study groups, and I will put them together on an impromptu basis. And since we've last spoken, I've actually had quite a number of actually more scientists join than lay people, and I consider myself a layperson. I don't have a PhD, and I'm not worried about that. It's part of the freedom of being a multidisciplinary investigator is that you get to swim under the lane line into other lanes, and it isn't about defending or promoting some specific finite specialized truth or hypothesis. It's about asking broader questions and questions which clearly span multiple disciplines, meaning organizations, practices, and human activities. So, really, I approach all of this as an anthropologist. And I want people to I want their minds to be as enriched by the reading. So that's another important part of what I try to share is I always include a good recommended reading list it really goes beyond the topic of HIV or this specific domain in science. It talks about sort of sociology behind how did we get to this point in history? Where did the concepts of dehumanizing certain parts of society come from? Where have we operationalized this in the past, as well as then some of those side channels in the science track, like the issue of cancer and the issue of autoimmunity and the issue of the safety of the American Tissue Culture Collection, the ATCC in Sausalito, California, which was basically the big Costco, the clearinghouse for cells and viruses used in research for years and years and years. And the reason that that's of concern is that there were a great number of contamination events there. So I try to bring people to the good work of all of the folks that have come before and make sure that their minds are set afire with that great historical context. As far as the more recent conversations with scientists, I haven't encountered anything that was really challenging or difficult. When I met with the panda scientists, I knew that it would be that the panda scientist group is an open source science team, so they are distributed. They essentially think of them as a blockchain organization. So it's independent scientists of different disciplines who approach primarily. They've come together to approach the issues of the pandemic and taking a look at the COVID pathogen, the S spike protein, and all of that. But they are clearly sort of casting the net to adjacent and related and preceding activities. So my presentation was very well received. And I was met really with only one person's, objections, and they were just essentially amplifying their disclaimer, their limitations. They were saying, I am not a lab biology or virology,
Yeah.
so I just can't have an opinion on this. And that's a very common comment in science, is just state your barriers and say, okay, I can't really, that's interesting to me, but I can't really form an opinion about it because I haven't studied it. And I know there's a lot of reasons for that, but um, the the ones that keep coming back, people keep pushing me back to arguments about, there's one or two documentaries that make arguments and include people like Dr. Peter Duesberg. And also, I think an interview of Luc Montagnier is in one of these documentaries. And people will come at me on Twitter. Generally, it's with that electronic veil, that avatar. So you don't have to treat somebody poorly. You don't have to talk down to them. You send it electronically, and so you can be nasty, is how some people feel. And they'll say snide things about HIV has never been isolated, and HIV doesn't cause AIDS. And didn't you see that documentary? And I did see that
Right.
documentary. And it was part of I began on that side of the argument. I began feeling that the early whistleblowers were simply suffering from PTSD and they needed something to blame AIDS on. And I went from that point of ignorance to where I am today, which involved a whole lot of learning and a whole lot of self-discipline. But I stayed open to both sides of the argument. And I didn't want this to be true. I didn't want the implicated parties to be at fault here. I didn't want any of this to be a reality. But as I've said before, I find it's not a little piece of pottery that was there in the dirt that suggested, it's a hint that maybe there might have been a civilization there someday. It was an entire city made of stone buried in the earth. And the more you dig, all you find is more substantiating evidence. You can go in any direction, of the science if it's got directions, and look at genetics, look at microbiology, look at virology, and find more and more and more risk that was being taken in general science with regard to bringing diseases out of animals and moving them into people. So these are some of the things that I think are meaningful in the broader context, as you said, about sort of refocusing back to the COVID discussion. People are finding the parallels in sort of the preliminary scientific work, sort of stumbling and bumbling into things. It appears that these more recent germs were much more of a aggressive hunt. It wasn't an accidental contamination because we were using bats in the production of human materials or biologicals. We went looking all over the world for new pathogens. And there are all kinds of semantic excuses and double talk about why we would do that. And all of the risks, the people that called out the problems with that, who were scorned and poo pooed by other scientists who took money for doing this kind of thing, are now vindicated, certainly, because here we are and we're being told there's going to be diseases dribbling down out of the icebergs. We're encroaching on the rainforest, it's the global warming, it's bringing all these diseases. No, no, no. All of the diseases, that's one of the great things about it. What you say, sort of bring it tumbling down, is that we see you can take any major disease that is now trying to be foisted by the WHO as a threat, as a potential trigger for a pandemic scenario again, and you can trace it back to the teams that went and found it in nature. That's not zoonotic spillover. That's called an iatrogenic event. That's when human beings harvest samples of dangerous pathogens from nature, and not just the ones that they brought in a cage, ones out in the caves, out in the fields, out all over the world. And they bring them in, and the double talk is, oh, well, we need to understand how we should defend against them. And in the meantime, oops, some of them end up as bots. So that's the unfortunate paradox.
Iatrogenic. Adjective, relating to illness caused by medical examination or treatment. Yeah. Well, you know, as I mentioned before the show, I had quite a bit of experience in the art of forensics in proving things through experts in jury trials. And
Hmm.
I was thinking that while generally you want a PhD or some type of advanced certificate in some field that's scientifically recognized as, oh, these people know more than everybody else, so that let's let them testify as an expert.
Hmm.
And the key to testifying as an expert is that you get to do something that other people can't do, and that is to give your professional opinion on something. So that, as you were saying earlier, and when confronted by, where did you get your PhD type of question, that diffuses the content of what you're saying and deflects it to an ad hominem attack as to, who are you to even try to talk about this very lofty subject. But putting that aside, there are many cases in which people have been able to testify as experts without having the window dressing and the diplomas. That doesn't get you to the witness stand yet. You still have to show that your testimony would help the jury or the finder of fact to understand something that A, is very complicated, B, that you understand, and C, that other people in the field that you are working in also understand it. So that kind of approach has to start somewhere. And I would just suggest that, you know, if I could ask you the question without going through the voir dire of how are you qualified, let's just
Hmm.
stipulate that that's not an issue. I would like to know, what is your opinion on certain things, such as, do you have an opinion as to what was the actual cause of HIV?
Yes, I do. It appears that HIV was the winning candidate among many, many, many what were called virus candidates that were part of the special virus cancer program, and that a great deal of effort and attention was focused on the simian type C RNA tumor viruses. And this is one of those. And there are several types of SIV, which is the natural hearth for the parent, the genetic progenitor, which directly precedes HIV. And many different types of SIV don't seem to be a problem for their natural hosts. But when you cross those to other types of primates, it can cause disease. And SIV contamination has been a part of veterinary science. And ever since we've been housing primates for research of any type, we've seen a catalog of things. And I think that that whole group of diseases served in the 1950s as the basis for a large test on the human population as we began using more and more primates in the production of human medicines and vaccines. It presented the opportunity to observe in the population the presentation of diseases that were unusual for the age group or for the demographic, like cancers and leukemias in some cases. In other cases, primate pathogens caused severe respiratory disease, like chimpanzee coryza agent, which after it was characterized in people and examined and it was determined that it was a chimpanzee contaminant from the preparation of human vaccines, they renamed it to respiratory syncytial virus. So I think there's both the precedent of sloppy science that then turns into other types of investigations and research, including biowarfare. And there's a great deal of evidence of that. And it appears that HIV was the leading candidate from this group of primate pathogens that were studied intently for about 17 years leading up to the emergence of AIDS as most of the public understands it.
Well, that's a lot to take in. And if I can understand what, first of all, SIV, simian
Immunodeficiency virus.
immunodeficiency virus. So that would be a precursor to HIV. And that,
There are different types. Think of kind of like car models. The one that became what you and I understood AIDS to be in the early 80s came from the chimpanzee. It came from SIV CPZ, lowercase CPZ, which is a specific variety or clade that comes from the chimpanzee pentroglyph.
and the other one that you mentioned was what we now call RSV, and you identified that as coming also from a different primate. Explain that one.
Also from the chimpanzee.
Oh, okay.
It was originally called, yes, they originally titled it when they characterized. There were a group of papers that were published about a couple of different populations, a couple of them human and one of them primate. And the papers are all in the 1955, 1956 range, and they discuss the presentation and the sudden emergence and an infectious cluster of someone who at an army base received a vaccine, went back to his unit, began presenting severe pneumonia, and gave it to other people. And it was determined that that was CCA, chimpanzee coryza agent / RSV. They renamed it respiratory syncytial virus pretty quickly because they didn't want anyone asking, why in the world does that virus have a chimpanzee in the name? That's not the kind of question that you want to be dealing with. So that's how
Okay.
simple
Well,
it is to cover up something like that.
that's a great example then, because th- there's a whole lot of, as you said, once it starts, the avalanche starts to fall, and you see the connection, as you see the connection, which I want other people to be able to see between
Hmm.
the all of these recent, supposedly zoonotic pandemic generated generators that have gotten so much attention and so much money thrown at them, and but just to keep it in the past, and looking at this
Hmm.
event in the 1950s, where,
Hmm.
what was the word, what's the name of the virus? It started with
Oh,
a C.
chimpanzee coryza agent, CORYZA, coryza agent.
Okay. And
There's an excellent PhD, Dr. Scribner, and she writes, I think she's Australian, and I can send you that paper. And she discusses the history. She talks about that transition where it goes from its original name to the new name.
so this would be generally a generally accepted scientific paper then, that could be introduced into evidence, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Everything that comes out of my mouth has hundreds and
Yeah.
hundreds and hundreds of papers behind it. Yeah. They don't say in the paper, we're inventing AIDS to kill blacks and gays. They talk about tiny, compartmental pieces of the science. This particular enzyme response, this particular molecular reaction, this particular genetic expression and similarity. Nobody puts it all together. Just like when
Well,
we were building the atomic bomb, we didn't put it all together in one big project. That's why it was in a honeycomb format like that.
stovepipe and everything. Well, go back now and connect. Is this chimpanzee Korea virus,
Cariza. Yeah.
Korea's virus, connected to the bigger picture that you just described, in terms of searching for a candidate that turns out to have been the HIV?
I don't know to to look directly at that question and face it with some, with some up determination. I
Yeah.
don't know that it will ever be possible to look at the huge catalog of viruses that they had, because many of them simple names like SV12, SV13, SV14, and there may have been um, each and every one of them might have spawned. Think of a family tree, where it branches and branches and branches. It might have spawned a whole bunch of new projects and investigations from that particular variant, or it might have gone nowhere. And isn't enough. There isn't a superset of data from the program that's available to the public that would allow us to say, yes, this is the one, SV26, that was it. There was just originally a huge list. They called it the Simian Virus Catalog. That's why SV40 is called SV40. And I know that it went up into as high as the 70s. And I just, they began then naming them directly after the lab or the institution. So I don't know that we're going to be able to have that answer and say we have found the exact smoking gun. But more importantly, we found all kinds of critical questions and cosmic gaffes in laboratory integrity, bioethics, the oversight of a federal government to operations like this, and whether or not it should ever be allowed, things like that. We found fundamental questions about the performance of these people, and the people that are doing the work in the lab, of course, have that compartmentalized, disconnected attitude of, I'm just doing my job. I don't really know what's going to become of this work or who's going to do what with it. And I don't care. I'm here to do my contract for the NIH. And the people asking for the capabilities aren't informing the scientists of what it might be used for if it's a dual purpose type of research. So anyhow.
But now, getting back to the whole idea of what is all this research aimed at? You said that the
Mhm.
HIV happened to be the winner of the research prize. So tell us what your opinion is of who's what are they looking for and why?
Okay, so the several parties are involved here, and we'll talk really about basically two of them. There was the public face of this work, and that was generally the brands. Think of like a NASCAR driver and his jacket with all the brands on it. Those brands were John Hopkins and New York University and University of Michigan and UCLA. Um, that was the war on cancer. That was the top of the iceberg. And on the backs, unfortunately, was a collection, a group of essentially illegal biowarfare initiatives that began in the Cold War. Many of them, clearly were watching and observing things that were going on in public health with the development of the polio vaccine, the race in the polio vaccine replacement between Kaprowski and Sabine, and the science that was falling out from that effort. There were people watching for pathogens. So you ask, what was maybe the underlying, what were they after? They were after surreptitious agents. So a quiet germ, a weaponized pathogen that could be administered, preferably, I would assume, because of all the different patents we see and how a germ like this can be, secretly or quietly administered, like a propellant, like an aerosol or a dart. They wanted pathogens that would be stable, that would be dependable, and that they could apply to generally. I think they were really interested in, when I say they, I'm thinking probably the State Department and the CIA and the Council on Foreign Relations and all of their courtesans, because those are not silos of power. They're webs of power. But they were looking for the ability to leverage this against a world leader who didn't align to their objectives. And those were generally just simple economics and geopolitics. If you look at the history in South America of, say, the last 50 years, I think I would be surprised if someone hadn't written a book about it. I don't know of one, but I've had people bring this topic up when I say weaponized cancer or weaponized pathogens, and they say, yeah, a lot of South American premiers and presidents have died of aggressive cancer. And it would be very interesting if the pathology work from maybe two or three of those could be compared by experts to see if there were similarities to, who knows? They wouldn't find anything that they weren't looking for, John. So, you don't just test someone's body and find everything that's wrong with it. If you're doing a particular test for a toxin or a disease, you have to have specific reagents. You have to have a chemistry that will help you find and unearth it. And modern DNA, mapping is beneficial. It helps, but it's not. It doesn't tell you everything. So that would have to be a very specific investigation, but one where we could take empirical data, particularly if there were any biopsies preserved that could then be tested and compared genomically to see if there was a fingerprint. So that's that. I think at the big stage, it was we'd like to have that in our toolkit. We'd like to get our way on the world stage, and this is one of those dire levers that we can pull to make sure that it happens. When it comes to HIV, I think that was much more towards the what I've heard newer researchers call the neo-Malthusians, the depopulationists, the eugenicists. I think that was more something to appease them, and I think that's more along the lines of Henry Kissinger.
Okay, so you're thinking that it is a military weapon to use to get your way against some leader, foreign or domestic, that is not doing what you want done, and that this, as being a secret, a silent killer, that nobody would really think that this was actually a military program. It just, the we've got all this pollution, there's radiation here and
Mm-hmm.
there, and people are just going to die
Mm-hmm.
because they die. But what's really going on is a military operation to weaken a nation, to weaken a population generally. So obviously, we should distinguish between a program that's aimed at taking out individuals, such as I suspect happens with my father, and a program that would be aimed at a whole population to make them all, sick, or enough of them to weaken their immune system, and make them really bad war fighters, and unable to uh, to stand when the attack comes.
We're wading in pretty quickly into some very deep waters here, and I think that there were independent or sharpshooter capabilities that they were interested in, and that could be leveraged like a scalpel, like a precision wet work. Without a wet work, someone would encounter some agent or agent, an asset would be given the package, and they could administer in some capacity to that target. And I don't know of all of the methods that are efficacious. There could be an inhalant version. I'm sure there are, with all of the things that I saw way out in the open in the bright sunlight of day on Nature and the New England Journal of Medicine and places like that about aerosolizing viruses. And then the excuse for that is that it's so that they can test it in larger populations and test vaccines. I'm like, okay, that's like a child, that's a child being caught in a lie and then just making up, just conjuring,
But
oh well, I was getting the cookie for you, Uncle John. That's why I had my hand in the cookie jar, with chocolate all over
And
my
and
face.
people buy it, though. I mean, this is like,
Yes.
"Oh, okay, yeah, sure." Well, and I have that same problem when I think of the whole sword and shield, which is it? And well, we make ourselves a vaccine so that when we hit the other guys with this with this weapon, this biological weapon, that they die and we don't. So we had to do the research in order to figure out what we could shoot at them that we could also vaccinate our own guys from. And that seems to be the classic, the way that I've always thought of the military side of doing biological warfare. But gosh, it's not like going after their army. It's like going after the civilian population. It's like a nuclear bomb attack, in a way, that broad dissemination of a virus that is just uh, there to make people sick and enable cancer to happen. I'm sure, because the weakening of the immune system, I would assume, is part of enabling cancer to take hold.
A sudden catastrophic poisoning of the population would leave an unpredictable number of people unaffected or would survive. It wouldn't be 100% fatality. And it would then be very, very, very clear and apparent, whoever was left, that it had been an attempt to exterminate the population, to just wipe everyone off the map. So if you do it surreptitiously and people begin falling out one at a time here and there, psychologically, people may become somewhat numb to it, particularly following the wave of the people that we lost initially with coronavirus. But then if there was something in the vaccines that was switching the immuno class from IgG8 to IgG4, or IgG4 to IgG8, if it was suppressing your natural ability to fight cancer, if it was triggering a number of autoimmune possibilities throughout your body because the number of tissue types that the spike likes to get into, and then your own immune system attacks you, and that presents as that whole spectrum of autoimmunity and cancer, that could be capitalized upon in quite an effective way. And you could extract so easily so much of the hidden wealth, the sequestered wealth in the population, the middle class, as everybody paid everything to hang on to life, to fight, to go to the hospital and do everything that's possible to hang in there. And that's when they end up spending everything and running themselves completely into debt. If you look at it from a financial perspective, makes a lot of sense.
Okay, I'm kind of blown away by all of the sweep of what you've just given me. I think to just focus on the things that are the most shocking. If
Hmm.
if people could understand that the connection that you understand between this research that they were doing, what motivated them to do this research, and why were they putting simian viruses into human blood serum? And you just say, well, your opinion is that they were researching a way to uh, commit mass murder. And okay, now at
You
that
want some
point,
substantiation.
no, I'm not going to ask for it right now, but I'm just saying that's where you're at in terms of your trials, your trial strategy. You have given your opinion, and now the lawyer is going to say, and now please give us the basis upon which you stated that opinion, and you'll have an opportunity to do that. But you've set up a whole lot of dominoes that have all got to be lined up and fall in order to prove your point, and
Hmm.
that is, well, that's what you're doing. And you've done a number of slideshows and presentations. And, well, gosh, I just wish I wish that you had the support of the professionals in the fields that you are an amateur in. because that tying those things together puts the forensic package together that a congressional committee would, I think, be forced to look at. And that's a transition from what we see, our opinions as laypersons, and getting it out into a place where the media cannot ignore it. And you know but I want I want this story to get out there and get really vetted. And I'm sure if there's parts of it that your opinion it doesn't hold water, that we'll find out. You know, from my cousin Vinny, does that hold water? Yeah, that holds water. That opinion holds water, and I'm sure it does. That to consider that they've been working on a weapon that could easily be used against us, the people of this country. And if if they let it go in Canada or China or anywhere in the world, it's going to cross boundaries. So I'm not saying that's what they've done in, but it looks like that was a plan that they had on the shelf that they could, say that, okay, that's time to go to Plan X32 or Plan SIV, and launch the next simian blood invasion of American
Well,
supplies. Hmm.
I think HIV wasn't necessarily the end all be all. I think it was a step, and they had two distinct populations that they had worked in before. They had literally just been working in a lot of field trials in Africa. I mean, Africans have been subject to compulsory vaccination and medical experiments for decades.
Yes.
And the gay community was just becoming a thing. It had never been a thing before. And in the space of 5 years, it went from the 1960s to suddenly there are these core communities showing up in the news and everyone's hearing about it. And they came forward and said, "We'll be happy to volunteer to test, strategies, things that might help in the fight against STDs." And hepatitis wasn't killing people at that time. They knew that spooky long-term risk, most people say, of cancer, that it causes liver cancer. And it is found in a very high number of liver cancer fatalities today. But at the time, for them, it was really just like, well, it's something we want to get over. We want to help fight against it. So they were involved in vaccine trials all during the 70s. What
Right.
began in 1978 was not, the first time that they had gone in and said, "Hey, we'll help try to fight a disease with a new product." They had been subject to other trials and compulsory trials in the past.
But can I just jump in and just unpack a little bit of what I'm absorbing from what you said? The
Sure.
the STD. Okay, you mentioned that that people volunteered to try to find a vaccine against STD. You referred to hepatitis, but you said hepatitis wasn't killing people at that time. Well, what was the STD that they were trying to alleviate
It
or
it was hepatitis. It was
okay, it was
hepatitis.
hepatitis.
Yeah,
And
and they were trying different things for chlamydia and syphilis. They already had essentially antibiotic courses that were effective on those, but they would try different things as different strains would emerge. But really, the ongoing battle that dribbled on, remember Willowbrook School all the way back to the 50s, that went
yeah.
from that point, those two doctors Willowbrook were there in the men's hepatitis study in the late 70s. They were part of the team. So that sort of just ongoing fight, swing and a miss against, fighting Hep B. They continued to fiddle with the formulation. And at the time that the men took those shots in 1975, the formula included a protocol that involved putting hepatitis B into a living chimpanzee, waiting for the virus to multiply, then killing the animal and quote unquote filtering out the hepatitis B virus to be used in the human product. So in both cases in
Just
1975, go ahead, break
yeah,
in.
so they filtered the hepatitis B virus through a monkey. They killed the monkey. They took it. I guess that this is like another stage of filtration or something, and kind of purifying it, right, in order to use it as a vaccine. Is that the idea?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
it's in the
So now they're
patent. It's up on Google Patents. Yeah, yeah.
okay. I just, because I'm just now understanding how this whole scientific process actually works. So forgive me, but just now from there, they have this vaccine that they're calling it a vaccine. It's the virus, but attenuated or but processed through uh, another primate's blood system. And so obviously it's going to have attributes of the primate in the serum, at least, if not in some particles that are in the bloodstream. So uh, is this is it your opinion
This
that
is this is an
this is the development of a biological weapon and not actual research into vaccines?
we have a very important example here, essentially the core use case about chimpanzees and exposure to people. And the question is, does exposure of a chimpanzee that's infected with SIV make AIDS in a person? We can go back to the I think it was close to 1 million doses of the chat oral polio vaccine that was administered in the Kaprowski exercise in the Belgian Congo. And they all got locally prepared chimpanzee based poliomyelitis vaccine sprayed in the mouth. And there were a number of cancers that emerged, but they did not. The continent would have caught on fire with AIDS at that time in 1957. Didn't happen. So I would say that based on all of those data points, just using a chimpanzee did not create HIV. It's all of the virology work of torturing a virus and transforming it, mutating it, and then pushing it into other types of animal tissue. That's what caused HIV. So what we're looking at right here is I'm sharing the actual patent from 1978. I'll just read a very brief passage. They're describing the materials that you can use to start building your hepatitis B vaccine. Quote, such plasma may be suitably obtained from clinically well human chronic hepatitis B carriers, or alternatively, from chimpanzees, which have been naturally or artificially infected with hepatitis B virus and have become chronic E antigen positive HB carriers. End quote. So that was the recipe that was on the book. So Merck used that recipe. The NIAID, anybody that was involved in experimental hepatitis vaccines could make that option. They could use human-derived Hep B virus or chimpanzee-derived. But my point is that if it was just chimpanzee exposure that created AIDS, all of Africa would have had AIDS in 1957 when they started the Kaprowski, because they exposed so many people to SIV, and they didn't get AIDS. Some of them got cancers, and that was of note to the virologists. So I would say that only strengthens the case that HIV is definitely the result of a modified SIV, which was one of many, many, many simian candidate viruses that they were monkeying with. Sorry about the pun.
No problem. And aimed at the gay community, which had just won legal rights to exist in public and could no longer be hidden in a closet, which deeply offended some people. I have heard of a famous doctor who made a claim that he had created it with the very intention of eliminating the homosexual community. Do you remember that?
I don't.
Okay.
Well, there's so much data, that and some things I just haven't had the ability to go and vet everything. But tell me more
Sure.
about that.
Well, I'm sorry that again, that's a memory that I have, and
Yeah,
I'm not gonna
it's
mention
okay.
the name of the doctor is fairly famous, but I'm not gonna mention it because I'm not absolutely certain that I remember it that well. So let's let that one go. But, and
Okay.
time to start wrapping up the show. Your opinions that you've given tonight, are going to be very, very helpful because to stick it out there like you have, and again, with us deeply respecting the gift that you've given us with all of this research that you've put together, it enables us to say, "Hey, look at this! You know, look what he says." Now, okay, he's not a PhD, but look at the evidence. And then you have also made available your little teaching modules and your videos and things like that that you can find by following Nick at Pizza Pickle Spur on Twitter. And I think that's probably the easiest way to catch a hold of your work. Am I right, Nick?
It is. And I'm happy, I would say, if you want to be included in a private study group. I do offline study groups where I basically spend about 30 minutes sort of charging through a timeline that goes from 1955 to 1981. And then we stop and you're free to go back and poke the bear. You can explore anything you want. You can go back and we'll take a look at documents. I'll show you the library. There's a living open source library that I maintain that's available. It's linked in everything that I have. I'll also tweet it out tonight a couple times. So if you guys want to take a look, you don't have to dig. Just go look on my timeline, and you don't have to follow me to get to the resources. But yeah, I invite folks to join if they want, or to simply take a look at some of the previously recorded events that I've kind of cleaned up and tried to make as succinct as possible. Tonight, we really sort of pushed back and forth on the timeline. We didn't really follow through a progression, but in those study groups, they're a lot more coherent. There's a flow to it. And then you're welcome to of course, all of the scientific papers. That's what I really want people. I don't want you to listen to me. If you don't know virology and all this stuff, you don't have to learn it all. There are other scientists that are starting to magnetize around the data and put the larger picture together. So just stay close to the conversation.
What's the year of that patent, please?
The patent that I gave a quote on was registered in 1975, and I think it expired in 1993. The period of most concern, at least in my research in the US, of gay men getting exposed to HIV begins in 75. There was an early, I think, like a phase two cohort, and it's the last group that's actually mentioned openly in a paper. And it talks about 50% of them at the end of the 2 year surveillance window were not available. They could not be located. Um, and that would generally indicate that the 50% that got a live shot had all died. That was 75 to 77. I found that citation in a paper by Dr. Wolf Smunis in 1979 as he was reflecting back. They were right in the middle of the national campaign when he did that particular publication.
Awesome. All right, it's horrible stuff, but gosh, we've got to unpack it. We absolutely got to unpack it, and your courage is very very much appreciated, Nick. Thank you again for being with us, and I'm going to put together what you've said tonight with some more research I'm doing about my dad. And boy, I can just imagine, when they gave him the hepatitis. I imagine it was hepatitis B, and I imagine that it was with the intention of, having a source for some hepatitis B serum. And I'll be,
If you're saying that you think it was a cleanup, then there are other examples, that I've seen called out. We've talked about Frank Olson, and there are others. But
yeah,
um, as much as we dig into this very difficult, horrifying stuff, it's horrifying when we get close to the actual intent of other people doing this to other people. Someone actually dreaming it up and making it happen. Just be hopeful and be determined that we're going to shine a light into this, and it's going to burn the vampires up. And that's what we need to do. It's going to be kind of surprising about how broad the implications are, but I think the world will be a better place once it's done.
it's going to be an avalanche, and thank you so much again, Nick. Um, I will be back with you tomorrow at 11 a.m. for a Minefields, and then I'm off for a week. So look forward to having a few days off with drummer. Bye now.